This is lecture 2, part 3. We were discussing the transport of oxygen by hemoglobin in the blood inside red cells, and now we're going to move on to discussing the transport of CO2. CO2, of course, is carried away from tissues, body cells, in the body tissues, where it's produced as a result of metabolism, oxidation of carbohydrates for the purpose of generating energy. So CO2 is a byproduct of that process. And it's produced and diffuses out of those cells and into the blood plasma at the level of the capillaries. It then goes into red cells. It'll diffuse into red cells and combine together with H2O to form a compound called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid production from CO2 plus H2O is catalyzed by an enzyme inside the red cells called carbonic anhydrase. Once carbonic acid is formed, it spontaneously dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. So hydrogen ions, H+, and bicarbonate ion, which is HCO3-. And the bicarbonate moves out of the red cell and into the plasma. So the equation is as follows. It is, and this is an important equation, which I recommend highly that you memorize and become familiar with, because we'll talk about it here in cardiovascular function in the blood and respiration, and also in the kidneys. So CO2 goes into red cells. CO2 produced in the cells, in the body tissues, goes into red cells and combines with H2O through the action of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. And notice I mark the arrow in both directions because this reaction can go in either direction. And it forms carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. And then the H2CO3, just a minute, I'm going to mark in the enzyme that catalyzes the reaction. It is carbonic anhydrase to form H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. And then the carbonic acid dissociates spontaneously into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. Now, the blood, of course, is after diffusing, CO2 diffusing into it and undergoing this kind of reaction, the blood then goes into the veins, draining back to the heart, and then goes up to the lungs, where it gets where CO2 is gotten rid of and oxygen is taken up. I'm not too happy with the way it's drawn here. Just a second. Let me fix this. That's bicarbonate. So in the lungs, this whole process reverses. The bicarbonate, which was in the blood plasma, moves back into the red cell, combines with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, and then under the action of carbonic anhydrase goes to form carbon dioxide and H2O, and the carbon dioxide diffuses out across the respiratory membrane into the space of the alveolus, and you breathe it out from your lungs. I should point out that bicarbonate is a very important buffer. It's an important pH buffer in the plasma. So large swings in pH or large changes in pH are prevented by the presence of that bicarbonate. I should also point out to you, and this is, I feel, an important point, that the most important stimulus, the most important variable that's monitored by the body, and that sensory information is sent up to the brainstem, and the most important one in terms of as a stimulus for breathing is not the O2 or PO2, but is the level of CO2. So the PCO2 in the blood is the key thing that's most important. If you have a higher CO2, then you get a increase in the rate of breathing, where rate is liters per minute. So as CO2 rises, that's the key triggering for an increase in breathing rate, respiratory rate. PO2 is a trigger for that. If the O2 levels are lower, then it will cause increase in breathing rate, but the body's not as sensitive to that as it is to the PCO2, I'm sorry. So, as I said, in the tissue, CO2 is produced, diffuses out of the cells into the tissue and then into the red cells. A little bit of that CO2 can bind directly to the hemoglobin, but most of it gets bound up through the formation of bicarbonate, and the bicarbonate goes out into the plasma. So that formation of the formation of carbonic acid is due to the effect of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and this is the equation that I wrote before and that you should become familiar with. CO2 plus H2O under the enzymatic catalytic activity of carbonic anhydrase goes to form carbonic acid, and then that separates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. And the reaction can go in either direction. Now, if you recall, with biochemical reactions, typically, if there's more of the reagents or reactants on one side than the other, if they're starting to pile up on one side, for example, if there's more CO2 on this side, then the reaction would tend to go in this direction. However, if it's the opposite case and there's more hydrogen ions or bicarb, well, both, then the reaction would tend to be driven in this direction. Okay, so in fact that lends itself quite well to taking up CO2 in the tissues and releasing CO2 in the lungs. Let's move on. So this is what's happening at the tissue level, and again the same reaction, and at the tissue level it's going in this direction. The constituent reactants that are accumulating are CO2, and therefore the reaction goes from left to right. And it's shown here what happens. You have CO2 coming out of the tissues right there, going into the diffusing out of the cells and into the bloodstream and into the red cells and forming together with CO2 forming carbonic acid. I don't have a color for this. Combining with H2O and forming carbonic acid, that dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, and the bicarbonate moves out and goes into the blood plasma. Now, as I said, a little bit of the CO2 actually binds directly to hemoglobin, and hemoglobin that carries carbon dioxide happens to be called carbaminohemoglobin. Some of it does dissolve into the plasma. I'm not going to mention the one just directly below that. I'm not going to talk about this process because that's extremely small, and Very, very slow reaction. So a small amount does dissolve into the plasma and stay there. The vast majority goes into the red cell, gets converted to carbonic acid, and then splits into bicarb, which goes, and hydrogen ions, and the bicarb goes out into the blood plasma. And that's what's described here. And then what happens is that the blood moves up to the lungs, and the whole process goes in reverse. And so you get the reverse flow of the reaction. Don't forget that, in fact, in the lungs, they're blowing off the CO2 as you breathe, as you expire, as you carry out expiration or expire, so CO2 is being blown off. So the reaction does tend to go in this direction. Okay, so you see the opposite effect. The bicarbonate moves in, combines with the hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, then gets converted to CO2 and H2O, and the CO2 diffuses out and goes into the alveolar space, and you blow it off. The small amount of CO2 that's bound to hemoglobin goes out as well, and the small amount that's dissolved in plasma goes out. At the same time, oxygen is taken up by hemoglobin and actually displaces a hydrogen ion, so you get oxyhemoglobin, which is hemoglobin bound to oxygen, and normally in the lungs it would be fully saturated with oxygen, and freeing up that hydrogen ion, so that's where it becomes available for this reaction to occur. Now, I just want to point out to you that every time you look at a graph, you should look at the axes. Here along the horizontal axis, we have time in seconds. This is the time that blood spends, the amount of time that blood spends in the capillaries surrounding an alveolus. So it transits that capillary going from the alveolar side, arterial side to the venous side of the circulation through the capillary in 0.5 seconds on average. The blood arrives with a PO2 typically of 40 because it's venous blood and it lost it released oxygen in the tissues, and now it's coming back to the lungs, and it gets saturated up to a PO2 of 104 because the alveolar PO2 is 104 and oxygen is diffusing across and getting taken up by the hemoglobin. Please note that the blood oxygen gets fully saturated, going from PO2 of 40 to a PO2 of 104 in this amount of time, just 0.25 seconds. So there's plenty of time for the oxygen to be taken up by hemoglobin. Hemoglobin very efficiently takes up that oxygen. And in fact, if the blood is being pumped through the lungs faster, even 3 times as fast, there's still enough time. Because if it would move through in 0.75 seconds, it would also get fully oxygenated. It would become saturated even if it was if the blood had a shorter amount of time, it would still get saturated because it only takes 0.25 seconds. Okay, so it's only in the first, it just takes that first third and it's already fully saturated. If for whatever reason the blood, the PO2 was lower, or the blood was moving faster through, it would still get fully saturated. Even if it moved 3 times as fast, it would still get fully saturated.